Hello, gentlemen. Today's discussion is going to be on food webs, food chains, and food pyramids. We've recently discussed sort of the introduction to the ecology units. We talked about ecosystems, biotic and abiotic factors within those ecosystems, biomes, and then that overall biosphere, as well as the biodiversity within that. Then we talked about nutrient cycles, specifically the nitrogen cycle, the water cycle, and the carbon cycle. Today, we're going to talk about how energy flows through each of these ecosystems in terms of food. So it all starts with the sun. Okay, as you can see here in the top figure, the sun produces energy for the plants and trees. And the plants and trees we call producers. They don't really consume any real food per se. They consume water and they consume that energy from the sun. Okay, and that process all follows through photosynthesis, which we saw last class in terms of nutrient cycles and the carbon cycle. So photosynthesis is very important here, produces the energy through the producers. Then herbivores, or our primary consumers. So they're the primary consumers because they're the first level that actually starts consuming energy through eating. And so they're going to eat the plants and trees. Okay, so they're the third step here, the primary consumers. Now they eventually become prey, and they're preyed upon by the secondary consumers. So this is now the second level of animals that are eating or consuming. And these generally are going to feed on the primary consumers, not solely though. Secondary consumers sometimes consume within each other, and we'll show you that when we start talking about food webs. This is a pretty simple food chain we're talking about here. And generally, the secondary consumers are either carnivores or omnivores. And a carnivore, as you can see here, solely eat meat, right? Whereas an omnivore will both eat meat and plants. So let's talk a little bit about the prey, the predator and the prey relationship. So if you watch this Discovery Channel video here, we see we're going to the Serengeti and we're looking at the desert or the grasslands here. And basically what you're seeing, it all starts again with the sun giving energy to the plants. Okay, and the plants are going to be those primary producers, or the only producers. And what's going to happen is those primary consumers are going to come along and they're going to eat and consume those plants. So they're herbivores, they're plant eaters. Okay, but what ends up happening is those plant eaters are generally become prey. And prey is something that is eaten by a predator, right? So here we see the antelope, and they're grazing. And they're eating the plants, right? They're sort of going around eating, consuming. They're our primary consumers. Now the cheetah, very quick, very skilled hunter, is going to use his speed to catch up and then eat the antelope. So he's now a secondary consumer, but in this case we're going to call him a predator, right? He's a hunter. The predators are the hunters, the prey are what are being hunted. So the antelope are the prey, the cheetah, or as you just saw, a lion, which tends to stalk and sneak up on its prey, are both predators. They're the hunters. Okay, a hyena here is another example of a predator. And then, so you'll end up seeing now within the secondary consumers or the predators, there's a fight, right? Sometimes they'll steal the prey from the other. There's big interaction, and often there's fights between the two. Very little, they don't really hunt each other. They're both hunters, but generally there's definitely some friction there as they compete for those primary consumers, so trying to eat those herbivores. So that's that relationship between predator and prey. Now, food chains are important, but they're very linear, and they're very simplified for what we're interested in, because food chains break down when you start getting into reality. because many animals are at different levels in food chains depending on the ecosystem that they're in. So food webs give us a little bit more of an all-encompassing approach and give us a better idea of what's going on in the entire scenario, in that whole system. So if you look at this example here, it all starts with the plants at the bottom. Even the food webs, the plants are the key. They're the very beginning. Okay. Now along come our primary consumers, so the rabbits, squirrels, mice, birds, insects that eat. So these are our primary consumers here. And then you start to see where the confusion comes. Okay, it's not as linear anymore. Foxes kind of the top here. Hawks and owls, very little interaction between the two. Also with snakes, these are the top of this food web or a food chain. But now there's some better, a little more interaction. The fox, it's not a linear progression. As you can see, the fox is going to skip this level over here as he goes straight for rabbits, squirrels, mice, whereas spiders are going to go after the insects. There's some predaceous insects that are going to eat other insects, but then toads come along and eat them. The toads are also going to eat the herbivorous insects as well. So there's a little bit more confusion here, and this is why we call it more of a web. My apologies. Okay, another way so that's just a general, so food webs follow the food. Okay, they're focused on the food levels as we move across. Trophic levels are another way that we can sort of follow the food throughout an ecosystem. Only trophic levels focus on energy. Okay, so we're going to follow energy through the consumers and the producers. So that first trophic level, right, you got the plants, then the primary consumers, and then the secondary consumers. But we're going to follow energy a little bit more, and I'll show you what that means when we start talking about food pyramids a little bit more. Okay, a couple other feeding relationships that we can talk about. We have decomposers, saprophytes, and detrivores. And decomposers and saprophytes, they really just focus on breaking down dead matter, right? So when we talk about animals decomposing after they die, that's what these animals, these bacteria do. Whereas a detrivore will probably break down waste products, right? So that's things like feces from animals. Okay. There's also things called, we have a symbiosis, and generally that's where you see parasites living within an animal and feeding off of them. They're not going to kill it, but generally it might make it sick or hurt that animal. Food pyramids, okay. Now we're talking more about, we're going to see them, so that trophic level, the amount of energy in a graph. And now it gives you sort of a visualization of how energy is moving. And so if we start with just a regular period of numbers, we can see the largest, this is the number of organisms at each level. Okay, so grass, you need a bunch of grass to feed a few mice. So you see a huge bottom here in grasses. Okay, and then you see a lot less mice, and then the snakes are feeding on the mice, and the hawk feeds on the snakes. So this is sort of a simplistic, this is definitely a chain that we're seeing, but now you can see the numbers decreasing. That energy is just energy lost as you go along, right? The mice eat a whole lot of grass, but it takes a lot of grass to feed those mice. Okay, and snakes, it's not one mice for every snake, so you need a lot more mice than you need snakes, and the same for the hawk, right? One hawk needs a lot of snakes in its lifetime to survive long term. Now, sometimes this gets a little bit confusing, especially when you're talking about insects. It doesn't really work that way because one tree can feed thousands and thousands of insects. And so our pyramid sort of breaks down a little bit, and we get this inversion that we're seeing here. As the tree, again, one tree feeds a lot of insects, and so the chain the pyramid's a little bit different as we get that a bit of an inversion. To sort of help that, we use this pyramid of biomass. Okay, so because those insects are so small, right? They still weigh, and there's a lot less mass than in the tree. And so if we take the overall mass at each level, we get a better indication of those pyramids. And now there's that, we avoid that inversion, and the pyramid works a little bit better. That's because in a pyramid, right, we want the bottom to be wider, we want a bigger base. Okay, and so we're going to use mass rather than just the total number of trees versus insects. So in this case, you can see the overall mass of the producers needs to be the largest. Then the primary consumers eat that, it needs to be a little bit smaller. Secondary consumers a little bit smaller. And then tertiary, this is just the third level of consumer. So that biomass gets smaller and smaller, as you can see from this video, or from this image. Okay, our final pyramid is called the pyramid of energy, and we determine this by taking the total energy that's available at each level. And so again, you see the energy decreasing as you move up from each first trophic level to the second trophic level to the third to the fourth, right? And so you can see, right, that the energy is always decreases. It has to, because there's some loss, right? We eat, it provides us energy, we use some of that energy, right? And that's the same with any organism. So a grasshopper is going to eat some of that grass as the primary consumer. It's going to use that energy as fuel to survive. So some of it is lost when the blue jay finally comes along and consumes it as a secondary consumer. Okay, I hope that's clear. If you have questions, please bring them to class. We'll be working on this when you get there.